Hey, we are live.
Right, good afternoon and welcome to the House Committee on the Environment. This afternoon, we are going to continue to learn more about sustainable practices, and we have with us Oliver Pearson. Welcome.
Thank you. Thank you, Chair Sheldon, and thanks members of the committee for having us. Just for the record, my name is Oliver Pearson. I'm the Director for Forest with the Vermont Department of Forest, Parks and Recreation. Happy to be here in front of the committee. This is a very broad subject, sustainable forest management. So we're going to talk about 4 different aspects of it. We'll do our best to get through the deck as well as answer any questions you have, and we can always come back to provide more information if necessary. But we do have a lot to get through because there's many different aspects of sustainable forest management we can share with you. So I'll talk a little bit about sustainable forest management in the Vermont context and the definitions we use, information about the forest estate. My colleagues will introduce themselves, but our climate forester, Al Freeman, will talk about sustainable forest management through the lens of climate resiliency. And my colleague, Catherine Servideo, our forest economy program manager, will talk about our use of forest monitoring data to assess sustainability, as well as how Vermont's forest economy contributes to sustainable forest management. So this sustainable forest management means different things to different people. I thought I'd start out with what is a definition that makes sense to us from the UN General Assembly resolution of about 15, 16 years ago. But basically it describes sustainable forestry as a dynamic and evolving concept that aims to maintain and enhance the economic, social, and environmental values of all types of forests for the benefit of present and future generations. We like this definition because it speaks to the multiple uses that forests provide here in Vermont, as well as the importance of managing forests. So again, as it says, future generations can continue to use them, to benefit from them, and they can continue to provide the important ecological and environmental services that forests are known for. A little bit about our vision and mission, because that really contributes to how we approach sustainable forest management. The vision for Vermont's forests that FPR holds is that these forests will consist of healthy, sustainable ecosystems and provide significant environmental, social, and economic benefits. So you see that language again, with broad participation and stewardship of trees and forests by landowners, businesses, government, and Vermont citizens. What we really show up at work to do in the morning, our mission is to manage for and protect healthy forests, work with Vermont citizens to promote forest health, supporting best management practices, sustainable use, and respect for the land. So this is sort of the 2 statements that underpin what we do on a daily business within FPR. Some basic data on Vermont's forests. I see you have the map in my presentation up on the wall here, so no need to talk too much about that. But just to make sure we're all on the same page, today Vermont has just under 4.5 million acres of forests, and that's 2022 data from our forest inventory and assessment data source, which we'll talk about a bit more later. But essentially 76% of Vermont is forested. The ownership is about 80% private, 10% federal through the Green Mountain National Forest, 8% is owned by the state and managed by FPR and the Department of Fish and Wildlife largely, and 2% are municipal or town forests. Our forests are predominantly this nice northern hardwood mix of beech, birch, and maple, which constitutes about 71% of forest cover. And then some conifers, pines, and spruce fir groups constitute another 15%, with some other hardwoods making up the balance. And you could say that most of Vermont's forests are mature. We don't have significant amounts of old growth forest in Vermont, largely due to the forest loss that Vermont experienced in the late 19th century. And then again, due to significant logging during World War II. And just because of the way we're managing our forests, we don't have lots of young forests today. So most of our forests fall into that mature category. We are, and I'll talk more about this, we are using the Vermont Conservation Design targets for old and young forests, and that influences the actions we take in our management activities. I thought I'd talk a little bit about trends in forest cover and how it's changed. And this is using that forest inventory and analysis data that Catherine will talk about more in a little bit. But essentially, that's data that the U.S. Forest Service collects in collaboration with the state to give us the best possible information about forest cover in Vermont. But what you can see is when this began, right before 1950, we were at about 3.7 million acres of forest. And since then, we've had about 75 years of expansion in forest cover, and that our forest cover in Vermont peaked at about 4.65 million acres in 1997. Since then, we've been losing forest. If you look at 1997 to 2023, which is the length of this data set, we've lost about 5,250 acres of forest per year. But if you just look at the last 10 years, that rate of loss has really slowed down. And so we've lost about 2,200 acres over the last 10 years. This data is best looked at in terms of longer trends, and there are certain caveats and degrees of confidence associated with this data, which Catherine will speak more to. But the point is that we have forest cover that's been relatively stable over the last 10 years, but we are in a slightly declining trend. So that means that forest loss due to conversion to agriculture uses and development remains an issue when we think about sustainability of forests.
Can I just pause there though, because we do hear a different number
Sure.
regularly. The number is usually 10,000 acres.
And so I don't know where that number comes from, and Catherine will speak more about this, but this is the best available data that we have for Vermont's forest cover using more than 1,000 plots scattered
The
across
US
the
Forest
state.
Service data.
This is that.
What everyone else cites too.
Catherine is the keeper of the US Forest Service
Waste
inventory analysis.
About
Yeah.
how that maybe that we have a big discrepancy in that number.
Sure. But I think if you probe the FIA data as we have, that's where these numbers come from. And so what I did was simply took the number 1997, which was the peak, the number in 2023, and divided that by the number of years in terms of acres over years, and that got me that figure of 5,250 acres per year over that. What is that 26-year period?
Yeah. Representative Tyler would be.
With respect to acres lost, are there concentrations of areas in the state that most of the acreage has been lost, forest acres have been lost, or is it evenly spread over the whole state?
We have the largest amount of forest, as you may know, is in the Northeast Kingdom, and so there's certainly been some loss, but I think you're more correct with the second part of your answer, where it's spread throughout the state. There's been some forest loss associated with areas of more rapid development. And so we have seen some forest loss in Chittenden County as housing has expanded there. But I think the general answer is there isn't like one county or one part of the state you can point to and say this is where the majority of forest loss is occurring.
Okay, I didn't mean to open up. We need, Mr. Pearson did say, like, they're gonna have a hard time getting through, so let's hold, we can get our answers. I won't ask anymore either.
And there's another way we think about sustainability is this concept of net growth to removal. So net growth is growth of forests in terms of volume minus natural mortality, minus trees dying. That's how you get that growth figure. And the removals is any type of harvesting that takes place. And so if this is a measure of sustainability that's widely used by foresters. And so if you had a 1-to-1 ratio, the net growth and removal would be balanced. Vermont's ratio is at almost 3. It's about 2.8. So that means that our forests are growing and adding volume at a rate 2.8 times faster than the amount of removal that's taking place. And the US average is just below 2. One thing that's interesting with this is that as our forests age, you would expect the growth to slow down a bit. And so often as forests mature, and as I suggested earlier, where our forests are mature, the net growth to removal ratio begins to drop off a bit. But because the amount of harvesting that we're doing has also dropped off a bit, the net growth to removals ratio has increased, despite the fact that our forests are getting more mature, and the amount of growth on average, that the amount of growth in terms of volume that our trees are adding on an annual basis has decreased a bit. But the bottom line is that a net growth to removal ratio of 2.8 suggests that there is the amount of harvesting that's taking place is offset, again, 2.8 times by the amount of growth. And that's a good indication that overall, the way we're managing forests could be considered sustainable. So some of the key principles we use in Vermont for sustainable forest management, this is both on public land and private land, because as I said, we have much of the land is private. What FPR does is manage state lands and also supports private landowners to manage private lands, particularly those that are enrolled in the current use or use value appraisal program. So these principles apply on both private and public land. But one of our key principles as we develop management plans or help landowners do the same is to manage for multiple uses and to plan for sustainability. And I think it's a great indication of our commitment to good management that over 65% of forests have management plans that promote sustainability, good silviculture, forest health, maintenance of ecological function, and water quality protection. That figure comes from almost all the federal, state, and local forests with management plans, and then 45% statewide of forests that are in the use value appraisal program and have a forest management plan that's developed by a licensed forester and reviewed by an FPR county forester. So these management plans are developed and implemented by licensed foresters. And Vermont has one of the highest totals in the country of state with management plans covering their forests. And then statewide, independent of if a forest is either in the use value appraisal or not, that's privately owned, as well as on public lands. The FPR has a couple different monitoring and regulation practices. We monitor heavy cut. We ensure that acceptable management practices are respected in regards to maintaining water quality, and we support the implementation of timber trespass laws. It's worth noting that subject alone was the subject of a 1-hour briefing to House Agriculture and Forestry last week, heavy cut and the AMPs. So there's a lot there. I was just giving that as an example of the type of monitoring and regulation that FPR does on forests statewide. Then in terms of planning for sustainability, as I mentioned, which is something that 65% of forests or more have, these long-term management plans, we use an ecosystem-based approach, integrating silviculture and ecological principles, try to balance active and passive management to achieve the range of outcomes they're hoping to achieve on our forests in the state. One aspect of active management is engaging in forest management timber sales or harvesting forest. And there we really use sound silvicultural techniques as the underpinning for any timber sale or forest harvesting operation that we're engaged in. And some of the silviculture methods that we use are mentioned there below. And we're also doing research to assess the impact of these different silvicultural practices on forest health. An example is with Professor Tony D'Amato from UVM. We've set up some research plots to look at, this was the intended objective of a given timber sale. Let's see if we meet that by doing a 15 to 20-year research project on site. As I mentioned, we're trying to manage for both young and old forest types. And so we integrate some of the Vermont conservation design principles in forest management. And some of the other objectives we're trying to achieve are climate resiliency and adaptation through forest management that I will talk about next, ensuring we maintain our clean water objectives and legal requirements, ensuring that the forests provide wildlife habitat and biodiversity conservation, and providing opportunities for recreation, and finally, public input as pertains to state land, so where applicable. And I think a great example of how this plays out is we were in this committee last year talking about the Worcester Range Management Plan, which completed last year. And I think folks may recall that over half of that land is put into passive management in what we call a highly sensitive management area or a biodiversity conservation area. And over the life of that 20-year plan, only 10% was set aside for active management through timber sales. And that 10% figure is an upper figure that actually gets reduced as we decide what aspects of those areas are indeed suitable for timber sale, which I'll talk about in a minute. I'm going to skip that slide in the interest of time. And because there seems to be a lot of interest in the subject of state land timber harvests, this is the process we use. So again, using the Worcester Range as an example, we set aside up to 10% of the Worcester Range for 12 timber sales over a 20-year period. And what we do for each sale is first we do a detailed resource inventory and review to ensure that there's no ecological issues or wildlife issues, historical resources that would prevent us from harvesting trees in a given area. So then we select a subset of the land within that larger block to actually engage in harvesting of trees. We then develop a prescription that defines how that timber sale will be conducted, what are the silvicultural goals we're trying to achieve there, which trees are actually going to be harvested. We have marking, and then we oversee we plan for the operations of that sale. And then finally, the sales are awarded on a competitive basis to logging companies that bid to ensure that Vermont's getting the best value for the use of that state resource. And so the prospectus development and approval is our process to really get specific about what species and volumes are coming out, what the operational requirements are for the loggers to ensure that they're following all the necessary requirements and protecting the resource, and any deductions regarding hazard tree removal and that sort of thing. So that's just an example of some of the additional work we do as we plan timber sales on state lands, just as part of our commitment to sustainability. So I'm going to stop there and hand it off to Al, just in the interest of time. If there's any questions on what I've done, Chair, we can take them now, or you can have the committees hold them for later. I defer to your preference.
Are you, how would you like to allocate your hour of time? Are you planning to use less? Because
I was planning to use 15 minutes, and I think I'm right on schedule. I have about 2 minutes left, I think, or maybe I'm right at 15.
yeah, great. Okay. Maybe a couple of questions. Representative North, did you have questions?
Just on that data plot, it seemed like the only statistically significant shift in the data was right at, it's about 2012 or so, where it just dropped.
Yep.
Whereas all the points before that are all within the error bars, i.e. there's no statistically significant shift.
Correct.
From, can't exactly read the numbers because it's all
Yep.
covered up on the screen there. But then there's a statistically significant shift all in 1 year, right, at roughly 2012. And then again, they all remain statistically insignificant in their shift. So what happened in 2012?
Yeah, maybe I'll see if Catherine can answer that question because she's more familiar with this data than I am.
Hi, so Catherine's Video, Forest Economy Program Manager with FPR. I don't recall off the top of my head exactly what happened. I will double check our data sources and see if I can come up with an answer, but I will say that the estimation that's done, this is all based on samples all across the state, and so there's just always going to be some measure of variability to it, but I will look and see.
But it does seem.
There is
statistically
a
significant.
drop there. Yeah, it goes outside
Looks
that.
like the resolution of the data got better,
So-
something.
Maybe that's what happened. So, yeah, some accounting change.
Yeah,
It's possible.
so
I'm
I will
guessing.
check.
LiDAR.
But I think my follow-on point then is I would say that anybody who attempts to calculate a per year change, that's an invalid argument because it would all happen in one step.
Right, and I think as Catherine said, it's best to look at sort of given the amount of extrapolation that occurs from the actual plots to get statewide data. It's best to look at the data in terms of longer term trends as opposed to 1 year to the next.
How are we tracking harvesting? I know we instituted some tracking. And I guess I'm curious because you're saying the majority of our forests are mature. I guess I'm just curious. Yeah, how do you track harvest?
One way we track harvest is through the annual harvest report, which Catherine's going to talk about in her section. But that's essentially soliciting information from loggers and from landowners. Another way we track harvest is anything that's done in the use value appraisal program, which is about 44% or 2 million acres that are enrolled. We're able to track through the oversight of the forest management plans that are developed and approved by our county they're developed by licensed foresters and approved by our county foresters. And so we know what's happening on those 2 million acres through those forest management plans. Then, of course, on state lands, we're tracking our own implementation of the long-term management plans that we develop and implement. So there's a number of different ways that we're tracking what happens in terms of trees leaving the land and being harvested and going to mills or used for other purposes.
Do we have, I thought we did like a ticket, some sort of like when a log truck went out.
We don't have a requirement today for either trip tickets or harvest notifications. It has been debated a lot. And I think in the context of the timber trespass report that was submitted, I believe in response to, it's not Act 181, I think it was House 214. Anyways, there's a timber trespass report that was recently submitted by the Attorney General's office. I think that debate is continuing in this session.
One last question, Representative Pritchard.
When you say lost forest, tell me what that means. It's lost to development? Is it lost to, it ceases to become, it ceases to have the ability to be a forest again?
Yeah, I think we use the word conversion where it's converted from what's essentially associated with the definition of forest to another land use type, be it a grassland, be it impervious surface, what we use in a development context, homes, businesses. So it's land that no longer is able to support enough of a tree cover to be considered forest. And so that's the conversion. And if you look at the annual data, again, which comes with caveats, we lose some forest to conversion every year to other uses, but we gain some forest back too. But as you can see from this longer term trend, we're losing more than we're gaining.
Thank you.
All right. Hi, everyone. For the record, my name is Al Freeman. I'm the climate forester for FPR. And for this section of the talk, I'm going to be talking about how we use climate and forest resilience as a lens for developing forest management. And so as Oliver touched on, Vermont's forests are maturing, but they're still relatively young in the kind of time frame of a forest and how long they can live. And so these young forests can have a little bit more simple structure, and that can make them a little bit more susceptible to these complex problems that they're facing. And so across the region, we're seeing more extreme weather events. I'll get into this a little bit more through the talk. We're also seeing an increase in predation dynamics, a lot more deer browse, especially in southern Vermont, which can inhibit regeneration and cause dynamics there. We're also seeing introduced pests like emerald ash borer, beech leaf disease, as well as habitat shifts. And so what I mean by habitat shifts is that climate change is occurring at a faster rate than natural tree migration has historically been shown to keep pace with. And this can generate significant lags in forests being able to kind of match that climate regime that they're used to. And so this can have implications in forest composition. And so with all of these challenges in mind, it's important to understand how our forests are going to respond. And so when we consider a forest that has a simple structure, is maybe, a little bit more homogeneous, has very similar age class, it doesn't have a lot of options for recovery. Whereas a forest with more complex structure, as the figure on the left here, if you look at this dot and imagine that being some kind of extreme climate event or a pest outbreak, there's a lot more options for recovering in a diverse forest with different ages, compared to a forest that's maybe composed of one or two species and all the same age. There's just less options to maintain that ecosystem function. So this is the core of what resilience is when we're talking about forest resilience. So to put a definition to it, resilience is the ability to withstand disturbance, such as climate, pests, and pathogens. And I want to kind of walk through what we mean by that whenever we're talking about resilient characteristics. So I want you to better understand why this image that is on the left is less resilient compared to the image on the right. So we want a diversity of tree species. And the reason that this is important is because not all species are susceptible to the same challenges. Some species can withstand droughts better, others can handle extremely wet conditions. And in addition to this diversity, we also want redundancy. And what I mean by that is we want tree species that have very similar characteristics in case we lose one on the landscape. So a great example of this is American beech is a really important resource for species like bear. They produce valuable nuts that they depend on. And with beech leaf disease and beech bark disease, there's a really big threat of potentially losing beech on the landscape. And also these diseases kind of reduce that viability of those nuts. And so in our planning, we can maybe increase more red oak on the landscape to kind of help fill that role of that species in case we do lose it on the landscape. So again, diversity and redundancy are really important characteristics. We also want various sizes and ages of trees. This is really important because some stressors have a disproportionate effect of a particular size or age of tree. Large windstorms like we had yesterday have a much bigger influence on large trees with dominant crowns compared to kind of mid-story, intermediate, or understory species. Also, certain insects are going to target or be more lethal to trees of a particular size, such as white pine weevil and spruce budworm. So again, that just highlights the need for having kind of that variability in age and structure. We also want structural complexity. So what I mean by structural complexity is that we want a range of spatial conditions that kind of create these unique microsites. And so this image here, hopefully you can see it fairly well. This is from the Adaptive Silviculture for Climate Change project. It's at Dartmouth's second college grant. It's part of this larger international program trying to develop climate adaptive management that can then be utilized for landowners. And so you can see that this is a really large intact forest, but we have these smaller gaps. So there's 1 acre gaps and 1/4 acre gaps. And then in between these gaps, we have a thinning that occurred there. And what's great about all of this is we still have that maintained cover of mature forest, but by doing some thinning in those areas, those trees can put on a new flush of growth. We're reducing competition, and that actually increases sequestration for those trees. And then in those gaps, we want to increase species that are shade intolerant or kind of sun-loving species that have more drought-tolerant characteristics. So species like red oak, black cherry really benefit from these larger openings. Whereas you can kind of see on those edges, we have a little bit more shade, and that's going to increase intermediate to more shade-tolerant species. So we're creating these different little microsites that are going to benefit species diversity, these diversity of characteristics that we're looking for. And this also is really beneficial for wildlife. It's new habitat that, moose and deer birds can utilize. And it's still, again, maintaining that long-term cover. So this, I just love this photo because it's a great representation of that. We're also, given past land use, we don't have a lot of dead wood on the ground. And dead wood is a really important feature because it provides material for nutrient cycling. It can serve as a future nurse log for species like yellow birch, and it can help slow, spread, and sink water. And so in our management, we can increase the amount of dead wood to kind of aid those characteristics that may be missing from the landscape. We also want to ensure that there are multiple generations of trees in the woods. So really focusing in on tree regeneration. Is it there? Do we need to potentially aid in tree regeneration by planting species that may have a more southern genotype to kind of better facilitate that adaptation to future climate? These are all things that we think about whenever we are managing our forests. And again, this could also be an opportunity to potentially plant species that are more future adapted and that might not currently be on the site, but are expected to increase in the future. And so there are several experiments that are looking into this to see the viability of planting species from more southern seed sources. And last, we want to help to promote biodiversity by protecting rare species, rare natural communities, and at-risk species and other unique landscape features. And with all of this in mind, this is kind of how we apply a critical lens into our planning. I'm hoping this also could be a way that you all can have a new lens of walking in your woods and seeing, do you have a mid-story and understory? What is the diversity of your species mix? All of these things can kind of help clue in how resilient your forests may be. And so now that we've touched on how resilience can be increased in the forest, we'll look at why this is necessary because of climate change. And climate change is leading to greater variability. So specifically with precipitation, as many of you are aware, the most important changes to precipitation aren't necessarily the total yearly amounts we receive, which has increased about 7 inches since 1895, sorry. But it's in the timing, frequency, and severity of those events. In addition to more increased precipitation, we're also seeing increases in drought frequency and severity. And there's been an increase in 2-degree warming in the summer, as well as 4-degree warming in the winter. And why this is really important with the warming in the winter is because when there's less snow, we're going to have more freeze-thaw cycles. And that can be really damaging to roots. So snow is really insulative for the fine root systems of trees. And Hubbard Brook actually did this really great experiment. You can kind of see this image here, where they removed snow and looked at root damage as well as the following year's growth and found significant reductions in tree growth. And so when we continue having reduced snowpack, we're going to continue having increased stressors, reduced growth, and all this can kind of be cascading effects of climate change. It also can translate to less moisture available for spring leaf out. And so again, all of these are really important. And the last component of that is really, for species like Hemlock woolly adelgid, they're really dependent on winter temperatures. If we don't have lethal cold temperatures, those populations will boom and potentially move more northward because they're able to expand their range. And so, in addition to greater variability, this can lead to greater vulnerability of our forests, which is conceptualized in kind of these two components: potential impacts and adaptive capacity. So potential impacts are really, what is that system exposed to? Things like changes in temperature, rainfall, what are the dominant species, what stressors or pests may they experience? And then adaptive capacity is that resilience that we were talking about. How can they respond to those stressors? So things that can increase that adaptive capacity are high dispersal ability, few dispersal barriers. And what I mean by that is if we have, if we think of Centennial Woods in Burlington, that's a very isolated forest that doesn't have a lot of options for dispersing. Whereas if we look at the Green Mountains, that's a really well-connected landscape. And so because of that, it's able to facilitate more of those changes and that kind of mosaic network. High diversity is also really important. So if we were to think about 2 different forests that are going to be exposed to 3-degree warming, an alpine spruce forest or an oak forest, they're going to have very different outcomes in terms of their vulnerability. An oak forest is going to be able to handle that warming much better than a sensitive spruce forest. So for the last part, I just want to provide some case studies where we kind of look through this critical lens. Here we have what's called La Playa at Groton, which is aptly named. It means the beach because it's all beech forest. And as I touched on, American Beach has a lot of future issues coming our way with beech bark disease and beech leaf disease at the door. And so if we look at this photo, there's not a lot of diversity of species. We don't see very many understory species. And also there's no deadwood and there's a ton of leaf litter. And the reason I want to clue in on this leaf litter is that beech leaf litter doesn't really decompose very quickly. It's really difficult for other species to grow through that. And so it can kind of perpetuate this dynamic of the beech will die from beech leaf disease or beech bark disease. They sucker out and just continue dropping these leaves, and it makes it really difficult for anything else to grow. So if we were to think about it through that vulnerability lens, potential impacts, we have, again, those diseases, beech bark disease and beech leaf disease. We have different climatic events that are potentially going to occur. And if we think about the resilience, this stand doesn't have a ton of diversity. It has a lot of landscape connectivity, but again, we also have really thick leaf litter. And so how our forest managers dealt with that, Scott Machinist, one of our foresters out of District 5, applied a low density shelter wood here. And this photo doesn't do it justice, but you can see that they're still maintaining of cover of species that we are wanting to encourage. So we have cherries, we have yellow birch, we have some maples, as well as beech trees that weren't exhibiting any diseases. And then within that, they did a mechanical thinning of all of those beech, like understory beech trees, and soil scarification. And so that kind of helped to deal with that litter composition. It exposed mineral soil, which really benefits species like yellow birch. And if you were to walk through this now, it's, again, I wish I was standing in the photo. All of the regeneration is taller than I am. There's a ton of pin cherry, sugar maple, and yellow birch, as well as American beech. Again, the goal isn't to eliminate beech from the landscape. It was just to diversify. And so they've done a really great job adding kind of those resilient characteristics that we're looking for, while also maintaining species like beech. And this also provides broad ecosystem services for species like moose and deer. It also creates soft mass like raspberries for the first 5 to 10 years. It's really beneficial for birds and bears and arthropods, which in turn are going to benefit birds. And so again, there's lots of benefits to these types of strategies. And the other thing I want to point out is these larger gaps are really great for these situations because American beech is very shade tolerant. And so if you do a smaller cut, you're just going to get beech back. So you have to have more sun exposure to be able to get other species that you want. And so on the opposite end of that scale, I recently toured Bill Sladek WMA. There's an active harvest going on here, and this is predominantly softwood cover. And so the management strategy here is very different. It's not as large of a cut, it's less openings. And the history of this particular unit, it was bought by Fish and Wildlife in 1959. It was owned by a paper company then. And before it was sold, it was very heavily cut. So everything here is pretty even aged, homogeneous. There's not a lot of diversity. And so the goal for this management unit, you can kind of see it's outlined in the screen, and then those yellow dots are where the actual harvest occurred. And so this is kind of a good representation too of like, we'll identify an area that could potentially be harvested, and then that yellow is where the actual harvesting occurs. And so
Where is this?
this is up in the Northeast Kingdom, in Norton, I believe. And you can see these gaps. They are actually centered on naturally occurring gaps where there's a lot of standing deadwood. There's already regeneration occurring in those. And so the harvests were really focused on kind of increasing some of that and feathering in edges to allow for that softwood cover to come in. Here is a better photo of that. So this larger gap here, oh, did it not pop up? There it is. Oh, there we go.
There's a little timeline.
So this larger gap, this is 2.6 acres, but it's centered on this kind of giant reserve of trees where you can see, hopefully, there's a lot of red spruce regeneration occurring in there. There's a lot of standing deadwood that's left. There's deadwood on the ground. And so again, this is a really thoughtful approach of enhancing that regeneration so we get a new age structure and to increase species diversity. And then the other part of this is that this is being logged by a multi-generational family. That wood is going to local mills in the area. It's supporting that local community and warming homes in that area with this wood. So there's lots of elements to this that are really important and kind of have that lens of a resilient forest and a resilient forest economy. And so I will end on, how do we make management decisions? Well, forest management is about thoughtful choices and knowing when to step in and when to let natural processes lead. And it's a balance of actions. And so we want to optimize multiple objectives and not maximize a single objective. And so these are kind of just the general framework of all the things that we consider when we're making our decisions. And these approaches aren't either or, they work together to sustain healthy forests for the future. And an incredibly important element to this is the importance of the forest economy and forest monitoring to guide our decision making. And so that lends me into passing the baton over to Catherine, but I'm happy to take questions before doing so.
Thanks for your presentation.
Yeah.
Then Octavia.
Brought up on one of the slides, future adapted species.
Yes.
How can you be sure that you're not going to be wound up introducing something that eventually will be deemed invasive?
That is a great question. So the way that it is approached is it's species that are generally very close in proximity. We're not bringing tulip poplar up from, Georgia or North Carolina, but it's species that are likely going to be here. And currently in Tony D'Amato's lab, they've done these plantings where they're monitoring every year and assessing. And if anything behaves invasively, everything's going to be harvested before they reach sexual maturity. So that's one way is we are following the lead of researchers in the region. In general, on state lands, I help develop these guidelines where we aren't doing plantings of, it depends on the definition of future adapted. So we can have what's called population expansion species. So these are species that are found in low abundance on the site, but are expected to increase. And then there's a range expansion. And so those are ones that aren't on the site, but are expected to increase. So more often when we're talking about future adapted, we're talking about species that are already present on the site, like red oak, but maybe sourcing seed from a more southern source that has genetics that are better adapted to drier climates. And so that's generally the framework we're talking about when we say future adapted. I hope that answers your question.
Just
But with lots
worried,
of monitoring, absolutely.
bringing in
That is a
species, I can think of insects that were brought in to control
Yes.
one thing and then devastate a forest,
absolutely.
or something that would be in an understory like privet that I didn't know.
Yes, no, it's all,
Years ago, that
it's all new
was considered as
species that
invasive.
are, yeah, but it is good to be mindful of, absolutely.
Thank you again.
Yeah, of course.
Hello, everyone. So Catherine Servideo, Forest Economy Program Manager. Happy to be here. I'll try to get through everything. Although I was born and raised in Vermont, I went to college in Georgia. And I've been told that I just speak a little bit slower ever since I came back. So I'll do my best. So I'll start by talking about some of our data that we use and that is available to us. And I think hopefully I'll be able to answer some of the questions that were brought up, but always happy to answer more. So we have a couple different data sources that we use. First that I listed is our Forest Resource Harvest Survey. We've been doing that survey and report since 1945. I'm now the custodian of it. It's actually a mill survey. It's not for landowners and foresters. We survey mills, both in Vermont, in the surrounding area, into Quebec, Canada, anywhere where Vermont logs go. We ask for volumes and the counties that they came from, and that's how we produce that report. We have our forest health monitoring partner.
Is that sampling or is that all of them?
It's a census.
It's everybody.
Yes.
Okay, great, thanks.
Yeah. That's who we ask to respond. We don't always get everybody to respond, but yes. We have the Forest Health Monitoring Partnership, so FPR is a member of the Forest Ecosystem Monitoring Cooperative, FEMC. And our forest protection program does aerial surveys, partnership with Forest Service. And then, of course, the FIA Forest Inventory and Analysis data. Just a really quick overview of that data set because it's a really critical one. It's one that we use a lot, what everyone else in the state uses a lot. So it started in 1948. It was originally a periodic survey. In 1998, the Farm Bill changed that quite a bit, turned it into annual data being published and a 5-year reports with the idea that 20% of the plots in the state would be sampled each year. The funding that has been appropriated for that program has not kept up with the demand. So we are now currently on a 7-year cycle. So about 14% of those plots are sampled each year now. And we are currently at the end of our cycle, so 2025. So I'm working with Forest Service researchers to review that data so that we can publish the next report right now.
Senator Nora.
Thank you so much for the, I'm a data guy, so I gotta ask questions.
Yeah.
I would think that, satellite imagery could be used to do a lot of
They
these
do,
calculations.
yes, they do. They do. Yeah. And like the next slide. Yeah.
Not doing that one again. There's no more questions till the end.
I am also a data person, so I'm always happy to talk with this. So FIA, it's a cooperative program. So the states and the Forest Service would work together in partnership, mandated by Congress in the 30s. And as Oliver pointed out, we use this data to kind of determine or find indicators as to whether or not forest resources are being managed sustainably. It also provides long-term kind of trend estimates that we can understand loss or gains of forest acreage, species composition, age, quantity, and quality of our timber, but also health. It helps us understand if there's new threats coming in or how those threats are impacting our forest resources. The plots are located on both public and private land, so it's not concentrated in one. When it's on private land, it is always important to just keep in mind that landowners at any time can refuse access to the Forest Service for that. So when land ownership changes, sometimes that happens, and then they have to kind of do another resampling to find a new plot. But that can always have some impact on the year-to-year sample.
The same plots are visited every year, every time, not every year, but
For the
every
cycle.
5 to 7 years.
Yes.
Same plots.
Yes. Yep. So this is I included this image just to give you a sense of how these plots are selected. So they use a tessellated sampling frame, and tessellated just means that it's a repeated shape. They touch, no gaps, no overlap. And so each of those hexagons represents about 6,000 acres, and they randomly place a plot within each of those hexagons. And then the numbers correspond to the year within that inventory cycle. So the ones they visit that in year 1, etc. So there's a couple of different phases to the inventory. So phase 1 is the remote data, and they use that as the initial land cover determination. And they also do some statistical improvements. They do some post stratification. That gets pretty far into the weeds, but they do a lot of work just with the aerial data that's available to them before they actually put boots on the ground into these plots. This next phase is what we would consider kind of traditional forest sampling, where multiple people are out on the ground measuring the trees there. And then there's an extra phase that is what they call microplots, and they really do that for the smaller diameter trees, and that's where the forest health sampling occurs. So then some numbers. So this is very similar to the chart that Oliver showed earlier, but there's a pretty important difference. This includes forest land and timberland. So in the green is forest land, in the blue is timberland. And there is a distinction between the two that the Forest Service makes here. So forest land is land that's at least 10% canopy cover of trees or had that in the past. And based on stumps or other evidence, will be regenerated in the future. It doesn't have any type of land use that would prohibit tree growth, regeneration, or succession. Timberland is unreserved forest land that's capable of producing 20 cubic feet of wood, like 20 cubic feet per acre per year of wood. So forest land includes quite a bit more. Timberland is a subset of forest land.
Is it fair to say timberland would be more productive?
It can be. So there, you can have non-productive forest land, it's just not able to meet that 20 cubic feet per acre per year. So that'd be considered non-productive, and that would be forest land, but not timberland. So by definition, timberland will be more productive, but it doesn't mean that forest land isn't productive.
Why the distinction?
Because in some states, the slope aspects, some things are just non-operable, or they're not by policy or practice, they're just not available for harvest. So those would not be classified as timberland, that would be forest land. And so they do make a distinction between the two. So FIA is a national program, and so it is a standardized survey for all 50 states, for all the states. So, and as Oliver pointed out, it's been fairly stable, our acreage over the past couple of years, and those error bars, looking year to year, it can become a little bit tenuous with the numbers and how sampling is done. And so I think looking at that trend long-term is really what's most important, because year to year, the changes are still within the error bars of each other. So it's really hard to say exactly what happened. And then Oliver touched on this a little bit. So this is the net growth, total removals, and mortality on timberland. So again, timberland, not forest land. So net growth is just gross growth minus mortality. Total removals includes both harvest removals, but also land use change. So that's conversion, but it's really important here with timberland, it also includes a status change from forest land to reserve forest, which moves it into the forest land category. So just for accounting purposes, it has to be a removal of timberland into forest land. And so total removals includes that transaction. I think probably the most important takeaway from this particular slide is that change since 2017 percentage for the annual net growth and the annual mortality. And just like Oliver mentioned, that net growth is declining, mortality is increasing. And that's what we would expect to see as our forests age. Before I move on to the forest economy, the fun part, are there any questions about the inventory data? Did a perfect job. Awesome. Excellent.
Oh, Representative Labor.
I haven't heard a description of soil types and various soil types will promote growth or prohibit growth. Is that factor taken into timber versus forest?
I know that it is something that they collect when they do the sampling. They look at soil types. I don't know that it is used in the classification of forest land versus timberland, but I can double check. So, forest farming, sorry, just all of the time. Okay. Whenever I talk about Vermont's forest economy, I just like to do a really quick recap of our forest resources. We're a forested state, 76% forest. Most of that forest land is considered timberland. So about 95% of our forest land is timberland. Most of it's privately owned, 80% of it being privately owned. Vermont is located in a ecological kind of transition zone. So we do have a lot of northern hardwoods, but then also in the Connecticut River Valley, you'll find some really beautiful pine. In the Champlain Valley, particularly in Addison County, which is close to my heart, you find some great oak. And then as you move into higher elevations or into the kingdom, that's when you start to see more spruce fir. As Al and Oliver said, forests are getting older, they're getting bigger. As a result, they're just growing more slowly. And that's because both old trees just grow slower, but also because our mortality is increasing. That net growth change is not driven by harvest removals. So what is our forest economy and how big is it? The numbers on the screen, they're from 2017. We're currently working to update our economic contributions report. It's a multi-state grant. We're working on it right now. But with this data, the forest product sector is the third largest manufacturing sector in the state. It's about $1.4 billion in direct output. And when you look at total output, it's more than $2 billion. So in context, that is larger than agriculture. So it is a considerable part of the state. It does a lot for the state. What about the state of our forest economy? How's it doing? There's a lot of challenges that have been facing it. Some of them that Al talked about. We've seen our harvest volumes steadily declining. Our processing capacity has been steadily declining. And the stressors and challenges that the industry has been facing have not really improved that situation and have frankly really exacerbated the challenges. So we've got climate impacting in-woods operations. That has revealed the need for more resilience and kind of more adaptive forest supply chain. We've been dealing with some shifting consumer preferences. So for a period of time, consumers were really interested in the dark woods, cherry and walnut. Now they've shifted back towards lighter woods, looking for ash, white oak. But it's kind of hard to deal with what people are looking for. And hardwood floors are not as attractive as they used to be because there's maintenance and costs associated with them. The market uncertainty is certainly an issue right now. Tariffs, and just uncertainty around interest rates and what could happen. These are not small dollar businesses. Millions of dollars and years of work and planning will go into starting a forest products business. And when there's that level of uncertainty, it can be really challenging to actually make a decision to invest like that. And all of this kind of comes together to really impact the ability of our forests and our landowners to really successfully manage their forests and achieve their goals and objectives. And that ultimately has implications for our ability to keep our forests as forests. So I did want to just really quickly highlight one of those unique stressors. So this is just a quick look at some of our non-local markets from our 2022 harvest report for the sawlogs. We don't exist in isolation. We interact with the regional, national, international markets, and this just shows the flow of wood into and out of Vermont. So we rely on everybody. This is, trees don't respect boundaries for both states or international boundaries. It moves across. And so we are affected by what happens to our neighbors as well. And then this is just a really rough, not great sketch, but it's what I had of a simplified forest products value chain. Just wanted to highlight kind of the different components that goes into our forest economy. So at the very beginning, we've got landowners who own that forest resource and manage it. They work with foresters. They talk with them about their objectives, why they have that forest land, what they want to achieve with it, whether it's wildlife, diversity of species, they want to do sugaring, they want to be able to recreate with their kids, whatever their values, whatever their objectives are, the foresters work with them to do that. They create the management plan, loggers implement the management plan off the ground, producing that primary product, our logs. It's then transported with our truckers to our primary processors. So that's our sawmills, veneer mills, and then also our energy sources. So where our fuel wood goes, that includes residential firewood, chip production for larger systems like that are used in our schools, office buildings, hospitals, power stations, and also pellet production, which is used both residential and some commercial institutional facilities as well. I will just note that wood energy markets have become increasingly important to the state of Vermont as our in-state pulp markets have disappeared. So at one time we would have sent a lot of that wood to paper mills. All of those markets now exist out of state for us. And because it's a low value product, transporting it long distances becomes very challenging economically. Next, we've got our secondary manufacturers. So that's furniture, flooring, cabinets. They use the lumber produced by those primary processors. So I think really part of this is just that it all starts with landowners. We rely on those forests, and we need to keep our forests as forests. And a way to do that is with having working forests. At a very high level, a way to think about it is that working forests reduce or can even remove the opportunity costs associated with retaining forests or maintaining forests. We know that there's a lot of costs involved with holding forests. And landowners who are able to realize profits, or at the very least, just not incur those costs from their forests, they're less likely to pursue development or subdivision as a means to generate sufficient income to maintain or justify their continued forest land holdings. The 2018 National Woodland Owners Survey reported the #1 concern of forest landowners was property taxes. After that, it was keeping the ability to keep their land intact. So we know that these opportunity costs are very real, and our forest economy is a way to empower landowners and enable them to maintain forests as forests for all of the benefits that they provide. And in order to do that, we need to maintain those markets, outlets, the supply chain workforce, and services associated with it. So I think probably coming up on time, so just really fast, my program, we're really small, we do a lot of work. And some of that is pursuing grant funding, like what I mentioned for that economic impact study, implementing the forest roadmap, which we now have and are working on. We received a $500,000 grant to start that work. So we are doing a lot, as much as we can with our 2 people. There's a lot of great opportunities coming up that I think will really help. And we look forward to working with you and everyone else and keeping our forests as forests and sustaining the forest economy here in Vermont. So I hope that provided some insight and how our forests support the economy, communities, and our forests.
Thank you. Thank you. Testimony. Do members have questions? Representative Labor North and Austin.
How many sawmills, commercial sawmills remain in the state of Vermont?
So in the 2022 mill survey, there were 39 mills that reported. Of those, I know of 2 that have closed, and I know of 1 that has opened. So less than 40, but more than 30.
In Vermont. Representative North.
Had that same question, but then the follow-on is, are those mills at capacity? Just leave it there. Are those at capacity? Are there more logs than what those mills can have?
Right now, I think they would probably all say no. So I think there's some challenges with log supply. The Inwoods operations the past couple of years have been really challenged, which has increased the price of logs quite a bit. And so there's been some difficulties with mills in actually getting enough logs onto the landing at times. But also the kind of other challenges, it's great to have log prices high for some parts of the supply chain, but when the lumber prices don't follow suit, it becomes very challenging to operate as a mill because your margins just get squeezed. right? Because lumber prices have been declining, log prices increasing, it doesn't pencil out. As far as actual capacity, I don't know that I could answer that confidently, but as we lose mills, particularly our larger mills, which is what has happened in the last year, we will continue to suffer and not be able to process as much, and I think likely to continue to see that export market be critical.
And we're losing them because of economics. I think that's the reason they go out of business.
Yeah, I think there's probably a number of reasons involved. Some of it is just like that overall uncertainty, and the economics of it.
Representative Austin.
Yeah, so the forest in current use, that doesn't offset the impact of property taxes.
I mean, that's kind of each landowner is gonna have a different, calculus around that. Certainly current use does a fantastic job at incentivizing landowners to hold forests as forests. But opportunity costs are still there. There's still something else you could do with that land. And, use value rates have been kind of steadily increasing. And so that can change the calculations in individuals' heads.
Thank you for your presentation.
Thank you.
One short one, then we need to move on because we're behind. Go ahead.
500,000, two people, you said, in your department? Is that a multi-year grant then?
It is a multi-year grant.
So how long is this sustainable for?
So it's a 3-year grant.
Thanks.
So, we do have lots of other grants too.
Your federal grant?
A lot of them are federal grants. Yes.
Thank you again.
I think we'll send you the forest inventory analysis data set with the data going back to 1997 and even earlier that Catherine and I both mentioned. And that'll sort of show how we arrived at that number of acres lost per year figure.
Oh, that's right.
That was in my presentation. So
Well,
we'll
that would
share that
be,
with you.
that'd be really.
Is that difference that?
We do have a significant, some people say 10 to 12, but now you've cut that in half. So now we need to know.
Yeah, we do our best. So I think I have an idea of where that number comes from, but I want to double check. But I suspect that some of this is that year to year variation that occurs. And it's really challenging when you just like 1 year to the next year. It's really got to look at the longer time frame. Because I have also heard that 10,000 acres.
I'm going to make a broad pitch for foresters in general using less flagging tape. And or if you use it, pick it up.
Oh, yeah.
You could just start, the reams of flagging that's out there in the woods and gets left primarily by surveyors and foresters is appalling. So one of my personal pet peeves, but there's a lot out there. It'd be good if it came back in or didn't get used in the first place. We didn't used to use it. So it has promulgated to an unbelievable degree.
Interesting. Yeah. Well, Oliver and I are both speaking at the Green Mountain Division of Society of American Foresters on Thursday. So I'll try to
You
remember.
could do to just let
Mention.
us know that plastics out there in the environment are something we struggle with and adding them.
I'll speak from personal experience. Flagging tape can sometimes be actually fairly hard to see again. So I learned.
I see it really well.
I learned
Apparently.
that there's some flagging tape that has patterns on it, not just color differences, and those patterns are what you'll be able to see a lot faster in the woods. But
I don't need to promote more, so don't go there.
I understand, but, like use ones that you can see.
I actually think that the forest inventory happened in my neck of the woods recently, and there's circles of blue flagging everywhere from it. And it's bizarre. It's just like you're in the middle of nowhere, and it's like another one. It's so somebody went a little nuts with it. All right. Anyway, we need to move on. I'm really sorry.
Question for you.
Yeah.
Thank you so
Yeah,
much.
thank
Of
you.
course. Thank you.
So, okay, we'll take a 5-minute break and then we do a witness